Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. At the end of each season, I like to reflect on my fishing year to try to identify weaknesses, try to identify trends, just to try to look at what happened in the previous year, take that information, apply it to 2024 to become a better angler. So I was doing a little bit of reflection on this past year and just kind of thought I would talk about some of the takeaways that I identified in terms of, our sport as a whole, and when I say sport, I'm not necessarily talking about tournament bass fishing. I'm talking more about fishing in general, which I think we're in a great place. We've got more users than we've ever had before, more anglers for all different species. It seems like I'm running into more people across the country that just love to fish, which is awesome because for me, I can sit there and talk to another fisherman for like an hour, even if I don't know them, because we've got something in common. So anytime we've got something in common, it creates kind of a bond from that standpoint, right? So having more anglers is a great thing. Now, having said that, I will say I do feel like our lakes are more congested than they've been in the past. But that's not even necessarily just because of anglers. I think there's a lot more boaters out there as well, whether that's jet skiers, pontooners, skiers. There's a lot of people on the waterways. So that is something that I'm really starting to see. And one thing that I think we started to move away from in 2023 was going to a lot of the same bodies of water with respect to the bigger professional level tournaments. It seems like we really are starting to go to some new places, some places that haven't been on the schedule in a long time, identifying some lakes and areas that haven't had the exposure. And with that, generally speaking, when we go to a new body of water, it not only has a pretty good impact on that area, that community, but generally the fishing's really pretty good too because they're not real well known tournament lakes. So, right off the bat, a place like Lake Eufaula in Oklahoma really hadn't been on the schedule at all. They kind of brought everyone in last year, and I think there were a lot of us that walked away from that area going, I like that lake. Like it's pretty cool to see some of these new communities step up, bring some of the tournament circuits there to get some exposure for those areas. I would really like to see that happen in 2024. And I think with the schedules that we're seeing, that there is a lot of new bodies of water, like with the BPT, the Chowan River. Like there are so many places that are probably like the Chowan River that nobody's ever heard of that we want to go to. We want to expose the Bass Opens going to Leech Lake in Minnesota. Like phenomenal place. Like that's going to be an eye-opening experience. So even though we've got a lot more pressure on some of the lakes that we continually go to, I definitely would like to see that trend of exploring some of these new fisheries. And I know a lot of that comes down to the communities. They generally got to pony up some dollars to bring the tournament circuits there, but I do think there's a lot of value there. So I'm hopeful that that trend continues because when you go to the same body of water every year, year after year, I think it's not necessarily a great thing on the fishery in itself, but I also think it draws a lot of additional pressure to those lakes, not just from anglers, but as a whole. Not that boaters are necessarily going to Gunnersville because it's a great bass lake, but what it does is it brings a lot of exposure to those lakes, and you just see more people interested in going to that lake. Um, so I think that's one trend that started to develop. I think we're going to continue to see moving forward a lot of new lakes that we haven't necessarily seen on the schedules before. Another thing, the elephant in the room when it comes to fishing right now is forward facing sonar. Uh, you know, the takeaway really is how polarizing forward facing sonar and electronics in general have become. It's almost like there's this mindset where if you have electronics on your boat, you're on the opposite team. It's almost become like what politics feel like these days, where if you're on one side, you're against the other side. And I really would like to find that common ground. I think the consensus out there by most anglers is that yeah, their forward facing sonar is an extremely valuable tool in terms of helping an angler catch fish, but there's probably a common ground that's not simply ban it or leave it completely open. I think from my perspective, with respect to tournaments, like professional level tournaments, there probably should be some form of capping of equipment. And I'm not talking strictly forward facing sonar. I mean across the board. You look at all other major sports, and there are very specific guidelines as to what you can and cannot use. So I personally feel like fishing should have the same thing. I think we could look at it and say you should be limited to 12 rod and reels in the boat. You should be limited to 50 pounds of tackle. I don't know, whatever those guidelines are. And I think that that would carry all the way down to electronics as well. But it's it's unfortunate to me to see how polarizing the topic has become. And I see it on my channel as well. I could be shooting a video where somebody sees that I've got forward facing sonar on in my boat, and all of a sudden it's Matt, your video sucks because you've got forward facing sonar on. And it's just I do videos where it's the opposite. If I did some videos this year where I don't have electronics in the boat, and everyone's like, "Oh, old school, that's great." And I agree. I think it's awesome to go out there and do it, but just because somebody has forward facing sonar on their boat doesn't really make them the devil either. So there's like I would just like to see the idea of where like everyone comes together, and it's not like you're a terrible person if you use it, or you're a terrible person if you think I shouldn't be able to use it. And unfortunately, right now, there's a lot of negativity around that topic. I think the anglers will be able to figure something out and figure out a way to work with each other. But man, it's been a polarizing topic in 2023, and I hope we can figure out a way to get past that versus becoming like this political system where everyone hates everyone if you're not on the same side. Another thing that I noticed, and a lot of this potentially comes from forward facing sonar, but it's not strictly forward facing sonar, is the value of fishing offshore. With the increased amount of users, anglers and boaters, as well as the advancement in forward facing sonar, I think the offshore fisheries are a much better place to hit in terms of trying to tap into some of those so-called untouched fish. What I mean more by that is more of your active fish. So from a tournament perspective, when I go back and I evaluate where the tournaments were won, offshore is definitely a better place to be. Now, I want to be clear here. When I say offshore, I'm not specifically talking about just fishing in 20 feet of water. I'm talking about not being bank related. If anything, what I've seen is more people really doing well offshore, but in like 10 foot of water or less. I feel like that has been a very good uh, depth range to concentrate on. And I think that's almost because a lot of that has been more overlooked, meaning, when people are out using their electronics, not just forward facing, but if you're graphing, if you're using your side imaging, all of that, what you're identifying is a lot of times you're better off graphing in deeper water, because if you're shallower, the fish are dispersing. You might not get as far of a good readout. And I've always felt like that is a good range for bass to live in. So what we're seeing is a lot of people are starting to really uncover that mid-range or shallow offshore depth range, and it's become a tournament winning type area. So I think that's definitely something that personally I'm going to continue to work on a little bit more, is that shallow depth range, but be off the bank. I think that's definitely where we saw a lot of tournaments get won this year. Uh, Another thing that I definitely took away has to do with, how strong tournaments are. Going into 2023, I really felt like we were going to see a lot of tournaments suffer in terms of numbers, just because of, the rising increase to play the game. A lot of the payouts are dropping. But what we really saw is how strong the tournament angler base is. There are hundreds and hundreds of anglers out there looking for high dollar tournaments. So, whether you look at the Bass Opens, which were, capped at 225, you look at the invitationals that were capped in full at 150 all year. You look at some of the amounts of field sizes that were fishing the Toyota series, 250 boats. I mean, it's amazing how many anglers are out there that want to play the game. I mean, there are a lot of up and coming anglers and a lot of talent that is light years ahead of where I am right now, even. I mean, there is some youth coming up that is just extremely advanced, and they're able to get at that level at such a faster rate than most of us who are at the top level right now. So it's, that's encouraging, it's motivating for me, and it helps solidify how many participants want to take part in professional tournament fishing. I still think there's a lot of work to do in terms of really making a good playground for all of the anglers in terms of a place to make a living, but it is very noticeable that the interest from anglers is out there. The last trend, or not necessarily trend, but takeaway, that is a trend, is how we're starting to see like a new, I'm gonna say a new wave of baits that are really geared towards that suspending fish that are meant to be used much more horizontally in the water column than what a lot of our previous baits were. It's almost like the jerk bait in a way. The suspending jerk bait was like the forerunner of this, but now what we're starting to see is a lot of these baits come out for your hover strolling technique, like our hover rig, the core tackle hover rig. There are a lot of companies that are kind of starting to dabble a little bit in terms of the baits and weight placement. Berkeley has got a bunch of new stuff that'll be coming out that is along this line of kind of that horizontal suspending type water column that has almost been very untouched outside of like the jerk baits, swim baits as well. But what we're seeing with the advancement of forward facing sonar is how valuable like this suspending middle of the water column bait can be. And there isn't that many baits out there. So I feel like, in 2023, we started to see this flood of baits that I think will only continue in 2024. And the exciting part about that as an angler is if you can uncover those baits first, you can really have an advantage because, if you can figure out which ones are being productive, which ones are not, you figure out what is the best way to get those baits to work, you're going to have an advantage over the competition and other anglers because you're going to have a bait that a lot of fish haven't seen. And if you can just figure it out, you'll be light years ahead of where the competition is. So as an angler, I'm really excited for that. And I'm trying to stay on the ball with respect to that style of baits. And again, there isn't really a good term for it. Like, I don't want to simply say it's the hover strolling technique because it's not. It's much more of like this, just a mid depth range type style of bait that's meant to be fished much more horizontal in the water column. So I think we'll continue to see that, but that's definitely an area that I'm looking to continue to work on. But these were just some of the things I kind of took away from the year. Overall, like I said, I think the sport as a whole is in a great place. I think if you are a tournament angler, you definitely are trying to evaluate, where you should be putting your time and effort. But man, there's a lot of the sport is changing rapidly right now. With new techniques, new things coming out. I'm just excited to see it. I think we're in a good place. And yeah, let me know in the comments section, what are some of your takeaways from 2023? What were some of the other things that you noticed that you think could be potentially players for 2024 or change the way things are done moving forward? I'd love to hear from you as well. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new video coming out tomorrow.